Hi, and welcome back. Today we're going to talk a little bit about IFR emergencies, what types of emergencies that you can encounter, and some general rules that you should follow when those happen. We're going to start off talking about ATC procedures when you have an emergency. For some reason, pilots are a little bit reluctant to fess up on the radio when something's not going their way. The fact of the matter is air traffic control, and for that matter even the FAA, don't really care whose fault it is as long as you are acting in the interest of safety to resolve the problem. Set the ego and everything aside and fess up. We'll start with some transponder codes. The transponder is a really useful tool because it's a hands-off radio. Once you set the code in there, you don't have to touch it again. Everywhere you go, if you dial in 7600 for communications failure or 7700 for a general emergency, it's going to literally set off alarms with every radar facility that's looking at you. And that's a good thing. It means they're going to start paying attention to you and offering you help, and also clearing other aircraft out of your way so that we don't cause conflicts. The other emergency codes are also important to know, although it's a little bit more of a long shot. You could need the hijack code at some point in the future. That's 7500, or you might need to know the 7777, the military intercept code. That's extremely unlikely you'll ever have to use that one. It's important to know these for their various use, and it's also important to know them so that you don't accidentally scroll through one of those codes as you tune in for other squawk codes. For phraseology, when you talk to ATC, the order kind of goes like this. If it's an emergency where there is an immediate threat to your safety, then Mayday, Mayday, Mayday is the call. That gets their full and undivided attention. It tells other pilots on the frequency to leave a little bit of room for you so that you can get some things sorted out. If it's not quite to that point, but it could be if you don't start getting some attention soon, then pan is the next level down. What that says is that you have an urgency type of situation that needs attention in order to keep it from developing into a Mayday call. And then finally, a very specific one, minimum fuel. This is not the same as declaring an emergency. It's simply giving ATC the information that you are running low on gas, that you may only have enough for one missed approach and then that's it. And it does not necessarily mean they will give you priority handling, but it is important for them to know so that they don't stick you in a hold for somebody else's convenience or something like that. So you fess up to that one early, and then if it starts to become a situation where, hey, if you don't start getting vectors onto the final approach now, you're going to run out of gas, you start elevating it up into the higher levels of emergency. Don't hesitate to do that. It's when pilots are hesitant to elevate that level of emergency on the communications that they kind of get left and forgotten, and then it develops into something that could end tragically. If you are given priority handling because of an emergency call, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got paperwork to do. If they require you to make a report about it, you've got 48 hours, which is plenty of time to consult your employer, a lawyer, whatever you want to do. So don't anguish over getting yourself in trouble by declaring an emergency. If priority handling is what you need, go ahead and get it. In the vast majority of cases, if the emergency is resolved safely, they're not going to ask for a report about it. They only do that if it caused maybe a traffic snarl or something about it catches the FAA's eye. Usually they investigate these incidents and they just give the nod and say, okay, the pilot did a good job of handling that, and they move on to the next thing. If you'd like a really great example of a case study on this particular issue, I recommend that you watch episode 6 of season 2 of Air Crash Investigations. It's called Missing Over New York. If you get on YouTube and do search of Missing Over New York, you'll see this there. And that's a really good example of how things can evolve into a crash that really don't need. One of the more common emergencies that we have in general aviation is gyroscopic instrument failures. I suspect that over the next few years these will become less common because we're moving away from gyroscopes in aircraft. We're using accelerometers and other more modern equipment. But for now, there are a heck of a lot of aircraft still out there with little spinny gyros in the instruments, in particular the attitude indicator, the heading indicator, and the turn coordinator. The first step in dealing with an instrument failure is to identify which instruments have failed. And a key concept for that is cross-checking your instruments. If you're always cross-checking them and then some of them start disagreeing with one another, then you can start to suspect that one or more of them has failed. If that happens, start using very gentle, precise, small corrections to fly the airplane. Be very, very patient. Understand under partial panel conditions what is going to be primary for pitch and bank for both straight and level and turns. And keep the aircraft in trim. You don't want to have to constantly be holding pressure on it or you're going to lose control of the aircraft. The key is, again, gentle, easy corrections. And let the airplane do most of the flying. The airplane is actually pretty good at that. Vacuum failures is the one that we train for the most because, again, there are still a lot of aircraft out there with these two instruments driven by a vacuum pump. And that tends to be, in that case, the most common failure is those two instruments. When we train, we simply cover them up, which means that not only do you lose them instantly, but you have a really obvious indication, a little sticky thing in the middle of the instrument. In real life, that's not the way it happens. In real life, they slowly start spooling down and going crooked on you, and you will follow them. Some of them have little flags that pop up if the vacuum goes out, and you need to get in the habit of watching for that. If you're moving from one aircraft to another, such as we do when we're flight training, take a moment to notice before you start the engine up which of these instruments has flags and what they look like so that you know what to look for as if things start to go cattywampus on you while you're flying, you can look for those flags. The turn coordinator also has a little flag if it loses electricity. If those things happen, then a radar approach may be a really good option if one is available for the airport that you want into, either an ASR or a PAR approach. Though that can really allow you to focus on just flying the airplane and not worrying about navigation. You're delegating that task to air traffic control in this instance. Another one to ask for is a no gyro approach, and what they'll do on that one is they'll try and decrease your workload by giving you a timed turn rather than a heading to turn to, and that basically once again taking over the task of some of the navigation from you, and they can vector you onto a final approach course using that method. If you're going to do that, use a full standard rate turn initially, but as you're switched over to the final handler that's trying to line you up with the final approach course, ease back to just a half standard rate turn. Communications malfunctions are another thing that happens quite commonly. Not quite as common as it used to be. And most of the aircraft that we fly have at least 2 radios, so you have a little bit of backup going Nonetheless, it's an important one because it can be a very challenging situation to handle. So we have some very specific rules under Part 91 that we have to follow for when we report. We have our basic information that we always have to report, such as the required reporting points, unforecast weather, and any other information related to safety of flight, including instrument failures. They go into some real specifics here. If you have an instrument or navigation equipment failure, you're required to report these things. Your aircraft identification is part of a normal communication, the equipment affected, and the degree to which this loss is going to affect your abilities to fly under IFR, and then what you need from air traffic control. These are required things that you want to communicate with them as you let them know what's going on. We have some acronyms to help you remember that. SAMHAP and the 3 C's. SAMHAP covers the things that are required reporting in radar contact. So safety of flight items is the emergency stuff. Avionics, lost, missed approach, holding, altitude, and performance. All of these things are required, and of course the first 2 cover the types of emergencies we're talking about. And then we have the things that are required when you're not in radar contact. So in addition to the SAMHAP, we also need to report the compulsory reporting points, ETA, and final approach fix inbound. That's on top of the SAMHAP. If you get lost comms, you have to stop first and ask yourself, is this something that I can solve right here in the cockpit? So there's some things. So the first thing to check if you have a comm failure is whether your headset is still plugged in. There's all sorts of ways that those can be inadvertently unplugged. You adjust your seat, and as you pull it back, your hand grabs it or whatever. Make sure that the volume is turned up on both the radio and your headset. So quick and easy way to do that is pull the squelch knob or push it or whatever it is on your particular radio so that you're really receiving the static. It's very common to have that one or the other of the pilots turns something down temporarily and then forgets about it. It's also very common that as you move around the cockpit, the little volume knob on your headset gets twisted down. Make sure that your correct frequency is tuned in, and then make sure that you might try plugging in your headset to an alternate set of jacks. Just if you do that, keep in mind that if from the left seat you plug your headset into the right seat jacks, the left seat push-to-talk may not work. And so you will have to start using the right seat push-to-talk along with the right seat jacks. It depends on how it's wired in your aircraft. Try tuning in the previous frequency where you know you had communications before, because it could be that you just copied the frequency down wrong. See if you have a stuck mic, because if you're transmitting you can't hear anything. And as an offside little note to that, as this stuff starts happening, don't start cussing up a storm, because it could be that you're transmitting. Dual comms, try switching to the other radio and see if that one works. That quite often will solve the problem. And then, is there a speaker installed in the aircraft? A lot of people flying today have never actually used it, but there is a speaker installed in most of the aircraft. And if you have your comm panel set to listen on the speaker instead of your headphones, you probably won't hear it. It's just a cheesy little 50-cent speaker. And then still nothing. If none of that works, then by all means squawk 7600 as soon as possible so that they can start getting people out of your way. So what comes next? You've squawked 7600, and now what do? Well, it depends on whether you're VMC or IMC. If you are in visual meteorological conditions, then the FAA would like you to break off and land if possible. Now, I will qualify this by saying, don't do that unless you know you can really land. Because once you depart the airway and head for an airport, if it turns out that the weather's not that great after all, there's really no procedure for getting back into the system. So you're going to create a lot of chaos. So make sure that you can really do it, but why would you want to fly back into the cloud if you've got a perfectly good airport to land in and sort things out? If you're not in VMC and you're in IMC, then the acronym AFMEA can help you remember what to do. Where do I fly? This is an order of priority list. So the first one is whatever we've been assigned. That would be our first choice. Our second choice would be what we were being vectored to. When ATC starts vectoring you, they should always include a vectors to blank, vectors to the final approach course, well, whatever it is. If that's the case, then we start heading towards the approach that they're vectoring for us for, or whatever it was. They may have told you to expect something. That would be our third choice. Or as a last choice, whatever you filed on your flight plan. If you don't have any of these other things, you can always resort to that. That's why we file flight plans. How about how high do we fly? And for that we use MEA, and this is not a priority list, this is on the highest of. So whichever of these three things is the highest. The minimum en route altitude if we're out on an airway, the expected altitude that we were told to expect. So we get a lot of clearances like that. Climb, maintain 4,000, expect 5,000, 5 minutes after departure, that type of thing. And then finally the assigned altitude. Whichever of those three is the highest. Now that may change as you fly along on the rest of your route. You may hit a segment where the MEA is higher than the assigned, and then it drops back down. And you're expected to follow that up and down. You follow it up to the MEA, and when the MEA goes back down, if it's lower than your assigned altitude, you just go down to the assigned altitude and stay there. Going up and down is needed for the rest of your route. When do I start my approach? Well, it depends on your clearance limit. If your clearance limit was all the way to the airport, which is quite common if you're not in a really busy corridor, then your clearance limit is the point from when an approach begins. If it's not, if you were given a clearance limit partway there, then that's a different story. So if you were cleared all the way to the airport, then you proceed all the way to the point at which an approach begins, and you stay there and depart that point as close as possible to the expect further clearance time or the ETA. Now, this means that you're going to take about 10 or 15 minutes longer on your flight than you had planned. Because your ETA was all the way to the airport, and you're going to hit the beginning of the approach well before that. You're expected to stay there at the beginning of the approach all the way until your ETA before you begin the approach. If the clearance limit is not a point from which an approach begins, then you're supposed to stay there at your clearance limit until either the expect further clearance time, at which case you can proceed on your way, or if you haven't been given an expect further clearance time, then you have to depart that point timed such that you'll reach the point where an approach begins at your ETA. Now, obviously, you're going to have to do some bunch of calculations. You're trying to fly the airplane, you're in the middle of an emergency. You'd rather not have to do all those calculations. And so when you're given a clearance limit that is not a point where an approach begins, insist on getting an expect further clearance time with it, so that it's just a simple time. You don't have to do any calculations. You just depart that clearance limit at the expect further clearance time. That's it. Hopefully that's review, because we covered all that as part of regulations. But again, it's really important to keep reviewing this stuff. This stuff is stuff that you really need to know like the back of your hand, because when you need it, you're going to be in the middle of a whole bunch of stuff. The most important thing for you to remember in dealing with IFR emergencies is fly the airplane first. That's important in all flying, but especially IFR. No matter what's going on, equipment failures, weather, whatever, your first job is to keep the aircraft upright. Don't ever be so distracted from that that you start getting into unusual attitudes, because that's going to be very stressful and obviously unsafe. So fly the airplane first, then figure out where you're going, then communicate. That's your order of priorities always.